introduce our speaker today, Lorenzo Natali, who's Associate Professor of Criminology in the School of Law in the University of Milan Bicocca. And apologies if I've mangled that. We're going to record the actual talk, but not the question session. If I could just ask everybody to mute themselves. And also, if you've got questions, if you want to put them in the chat, and we'll hopefully get to them towards the end. Or you can raise your hand when we get to the Q&A session. So without further ado, I'll hand you over to Lorenzo.
Thank you very much. Please tell me if the slide work changing. And
Yep.
It's really a pleasure, really, to be here. And sorry for my voice, but I have a little flu and I'm not very well. But I desire to be here with you today, also because the invitation was organized and since a long time. So it was really a pity. So I'm very happy to share today. Again, for some people I see also in the connected today that they already know my approach, but more people I think that don't know very well this idea of visual criminology. So I wanted to start from the basis of my approach, also from the starting idea I developed during all this year. So this is the title for my presentation, The Social Perception of Environmental Victimization, a Visual and Sensory Methodological Proposal. I'm repeating the title because in every word and aspect I tried to include some crucial aspect of my research activity. We can start from the social perception. So along with some previous seminar, I remember of the constructionist green criminologist seminar, I approached the idea of environmental harm, environmental victimization in this context as a construct, a social construct that we have to reconstruct with a sort of multiplicity of theoretical and methodological tools. So this constructionist approach is common also to my view, and in particular, this theoretical premise is, in my view, this approach is connected to the idea of George Herbert Mead, the father of symbolic interactionism, but also to Herbert Blumer and to Lonnie Athens, who is a criminologist who studied a lot violence in the traditional sense, so physical violence as homicide, sexual assault, aggression, and so on. But I try to use some kind of concept, sensitizing concept, as they call it, symbolic interactionist, in order to approach also environmental harm. So I think that here the challenge in my research activity, but also I would like to share some open question to you so that we can dialogue and think together. That is the most important thing, is to add new theoretical and methodological tools in order to see differently some kind of violence as the ecological violence that for us as green criminologists is so relevant, that normally have been confined in the invisible part of the universe. I use this metaphor also with this kind of image of the elephant, the invisible elephant, because I really think, and this is the title of one of my first contribution in green criminology in a book edited by Rob White in a long time ago, I think in 2010, that is the big elephant in the backyard of criminology, changing a little my expression, in the sense that since the beginning, environmental harm and before green criminology was something that simply didn't exist in the eyes, in the perspective of criminology, even if obviously environmental harm existed and produced a lot of harm. So sharing with you also my first idea regarding this field. was that I wanted to search for something like a methodological tool that could challenge the invisibility of the issue, environmental harm, using paradoxically a visible tool, that is a visual methodology. I know that at this point of my presentation, this seems quite maybe abstract premises, but I will try to make them more concrete. Also in the title, I expressed this visual methodological proposal, but also I added a sensory methodological proposal. And the visual and the sensory obviously are not the same, in the sense that the visual is mainly connected to our ways of seeing, using an expression by John Berger, a sociologist and a thinker really relevant in scientific and humanistic literature. But sensory is something wider, so it encompasses also our bodies, our ways of sensing things that go beyond also the visual. And reflecting on this issue, during the years, I moved slowly and with some go and return from the visual to the sensory. And in recent years, an important, emergent but important field of criminology, sensory criminology, is being established since the next year will be published the first handbook of sensory criminology by Routledge, I think. So I think that these kind of sensibilities I'm sharing with you are something that now are quite established, even if in our small field of visual inside green criminology, but at the same time are really emergent and also very creative dimension of exploring environmental harm. So I go to the specific aim of my approach. And since the beginning, I try to imagine and realize a qualitative visual approach useful for carrying out ethnographic and collaborative research on the social perception of environmental crime and harm. And as you are an audience very well qualified, you know the difference between crime and harm and how it is very important also from a critical point of view in criminology to highlight how green criminology go beyond simply what is prescribed by law, by criminal law, but we go much more in the harm dimension. So my idea was that a way to give a more concrete sense of what is environmental harm, what may be, because we are in a constructionist approach, as we were saying, is dialoguing and listening, actively listening, people who were affected by this kind of harm. So I had this kind of two quite clear idea. I wanted a different methodological tool, but I wanted a methodological tool that also was able to be in dialogue, in a sensitive dialogue with people affected by the harm, what we call environmental victims. Even if the term victim is quite complex, is also quite ambiguous because a lot of environmental people affected by environmental harm don't want to be defined, labeled as victims, because it seems that the word victim is something very passive and they feel that they want to change the situation where they are. So given this kind of premise, I oriented my research toward the idea of multiplicity. Multiplicity is not something simply philosophical, but is something very concrete, because it means that we need to see from different point of view, for a multiplicity of point of view, the object of the subject of our research. So a multiplicity of ways of seeing was necessary, but also a ways of sensing, as we were saying, because we sense not only with the eyes, but with our body, with all our senses together, but also, and this is another important point for me, our ways of narrating. So it is not sufficient in this vision also of methodology and theory in green criminology, that we see, that we sense. We need also to narrate. And this is a link that was confirmed, in my view, also by the emergence of a new landscape in the theoretical criminological horizon that I tried to connect. So I share with you this slide just to put on the table the building blocks I worked on in order to progressively construct my approach. So obviously green criminology, I don't define green criminology because we are in a field that everybody knows about this, but this approach is the crucial perspective in order to see differently what is defined and maybe defined as social harm, but also obviously green cultural criminology as defined by Avi Bridgman and Nigel South. You may know, but I want to define it as a perspective that try to imagine new modes of analyzing critically the intersection of culture, crime, justice, and environment. So we have a lot of important issue here. But then something new emerged. We have narrative criminology by Lois Presser and Sandberg that originally was not oriented toward the green aspect of criminology. But slowly, this kind of sensibility to narration, to our way of constructing story as individuals, but also as communities, and this is very important for us because in many cases, green harm affect communities, not only individuals. This kind of narrative sensibility approached the green issue, also thanks to some contribution by, again, Avi Bridgman, but not only. But in my view, was not sufficient, even it was quite complex, because I needed something that literally could open our eyes, but our body also, so the visual and the sensory, to the personal and collective experiences of environmental victimization. So I started imagining a methodology that I named some years ago, but then the most important thing is that progressively also this kind of international criminological framework as visual criminology, sensory criminology, and so on, converged also in this kind of direction. So I felt that it was very important to try to widen the resonances of this idea, so that could be useful also for different scholars, for different scenarios. And I will show you why. The first moment, first phase I want to highlight now is something that is not visual in this moment, is a passage from narrative criminology to narrative victimology. I want to highlight this aspect because I always studied the issue of environmental victims. So my field in green criminology has been mainly green victimology, even if I didn't define my approach as a victimological approach, but my issue was that issue. How people who suffered environmental harm could try to give a meaning to what they were experiencing. And I found very useful the study of scholars as Anthony Pemberton, for example, and colleagues, who demonstrated very well recently that the study of crime and harm, and also environmental crime obviously, would benefit from a distinct perspective to narrative criminology, that is a narrative victimology. Narrative victimology would focus on how people experience wrongdoing, redirecting focus and perspectives to understanding what has been done to us, and suggesting that the impact of victimization can be understood in terms of its narrative implication. That is, the influence victimization has on the life and on the personal stories of victims. And when I read this kind of observation by Pemberton and colleagues, I really found a very interesting place where to intersect again all this kind of sensibility. Because the more I was listening to environmental victims or people affected by this kind of environmental harm, the more I was thinking that the core, the heart of this study was their stories of injustice, how they perceived the injustice of being an environmental victim. Even when this kind of perception was not so clear, in the sense that as a sociologist, Augiero as Winston, I cite them in this slide, suggest there is a large amount of sociological literature concerned with the study of view, so our vision, sentiments, our emotion, and responses of people who live in polluted and health-threatening environments. This is a very interesting study by Augiero and Winston in the sociological field, because they studied a shanty town in Buenos Aires where there is a lot of traditional violence, but also a lot of environmental degradation and violence. And they suggested that normally the paradigm that we use to explain this kind of situation is a sort of simplistic Marxist paradigm, in the sense that sometimes when there is an environmental harm, scholars tend to see as a group of compact victims, all convinced that they have to come back to react to that situation. But in reality, if you go near to the situation, if you observe nearer as a sort of ethnographic gaze and eyes, you see how victims of environmental harms are very different from each other. There are victims who feel very deeply this kind of injustice, but there are victims that are much more confused about the origin of the harm and so on. So again, with Aguirre's wisdom, I slowly developed a consciousness, a reflexive approach as a researcher, that we needed an approach that was much more complex about also the possibility of people to react, to respond. I was very surprised by the fact that in very tragic and critical situation of environmental disaster, people in a lot of situation remained in a sort of passive attitude, something like an apathy. The idea that they didn't know and they didn't want to act. Also, recalling the very well-known sense of powerless that victims of environmental harm have, because they feel that the power of corporation obviously is much more, it's bigger and bigger in a confrontation with people, common people confronting environmental harm. So for a lot of situation and characteristic also of environmental victimization, this kind of scenario of environmental harm that affected people, concrete people, remained hidden in the shadows and underexplored. This was also suggested by Matthew Hall, whose studies are very important in our field. And this was this kind of issue that I called the elephant in the room, as I suggested in the beginning. And the elephant in the room obviously is a metaphor to say that there is something very complex that we all are seeing, but at the same time, we are not able to confront with this issue because it's too big, it's too complex. So each of us touch metaphorically just a small part of the issue, but we need a very complex and um, multidisciplinary approach. So going more directly to the core of this issue, during my path in this very interesting and important field of criminology, green criminology or eco-global criminology, depending on the various definitions. I found this definition by the sociology Rob Nixon very, very important because he succeeded in giving a new dignity, a new focus, sorry, on the idea that also environmental harm is a kind of violence. Mm. So he says, I'm reading because he's so eloquent in this aspect, we urgently need to rethink politically, imaginatively, and theoretically what we call slow violence. By slow violence, I mean a violence that occurs gradually and out of sight. You see how there is this idea of invisibility. A violence of delayed destruction that is dispersed across time and space. Violence is conceived customarily as an event or action that is immediate in time, explosive, spectacular, as when we imagine a gun, traditional violence. But we need, I believe, with Rob Nixon, to engage a different kind of violence, a violence that is neither spectacular nor instantaneous, but incremental. So very slowly, this kind of environmental harm becomes an environmental disaster. But this kind of different speed and different kind of visibility is very challenging for us because challenge our traditional ways of imagining the harm and the crime. So I go directly to this idea of challenging the invisibility. As you know very well, in the green field, we have a lot of process of denial and greenwashing. I am not defining this aspect because are quite well known in our field. So denial is by this idea by Stanley Cohen, where people, as in the image, try not to see what is in front of them, as in the elephant in the room. And we may say that denial is a sort of consciousness mixed up with unconsciousness. So we know that something is there, but at the same time we are neutralizing our consciousness of this. At the same time, there is this greenwashing idea that in many cases is realized by visual technique. So I remembering this idea that a factory very polluting is painted with very brilliant color in order to change also the perception that people have about this, just to communicate a different message, convey a different message that they are polluting, but it's not so terrible. So it is the idea that we can change the meaning, the appearance of things in order to put in invisible place the environmental harm that are producing. So in order to to realize all these kind of passages, I explored a field now something like 15 years ago, the field of visual sociology, because at the time there was not a visual criminology. So I met some people that helped me to understand that a research with images is different from a research on images. A research, in this case, green criminology research with images, it means that we can use images, as a means of eliciting empirical data. Photo elicitation is an example. the way of asking question not verbally, but proposing the interviewee to interpret an image that is very complex, ambiguous, and difficult to define, obviously. But also there is a green criminology on images, when we can study found images that circulate every day in the social, cultural, historical, and artistic world. We have a lot of work of Avi Bridgman, Nigel South, Byrne about this, so I will leave on them on this level. But I wanted to share with you my two example, very concrete, to give you also a sense of the thing that we are saying that are quite also complex and philosophical in some way. They have to be really approached with a concrete sense also of meeting and encountering environmental victims. So I use a green criminological approach with images, not on images. That is, I use images to elicit, to let emerge narratives, again, narrative victimologies, from environmental victims. And these two techniques were imagined by me in two different moments of my research. I started with photo elicitation. That was quite very well used technique in sociology, visual sociology. But then I moved toward a sensory methodology, a sort of mobile methodology that I called itinerant soliloquies. It is something, a strange expression, itinerant soliloquies, but I will try to be very clear since the beginning. Soliloquy is the idea, since the beginning I approached this field from the perspective of symbolic interactionism, Mead, Bloomer, and so on. The idea is that when we interpret reality, we do this dialoguing with ourselves, interpreting a situation. So if I perceive a similar situation to another person who is affected by environmental victimization, my interpretation of what is happening and also of the gravity, the seriousness of the harm that are happening will be very different from other person, because I have a unique perspective toward that kind of phenomenon, even if I am situated in a social context. I can say that this is my narrative inside a social narrative. So this soliloquy is this idea, is that we have to give listening to personal narrative of people. The thing that we were saying at the beginning about narrative victimology. Why itinerant? Itinerant because when I used photo elicitation, that is, I shared images to people and asked them to interpret the images, at a certain point, I wanted to do something more. I wanted to share not only the image, but we may say metaphorically, I wanted to share the landscape inside which these people were lived. So if they lived in a polluted environment, I asked them to search for itinerary, a route, a path that for them represented the most significant place in order to narrate their form of environmental victimization. So it is a soliloquy, that is a dialogue with ourselves, an interpersonal interpretation, that is created, developed during a movement in the environment where we live. So this kind of attempt was the attempt to connect our way of construct our interpretation of environmental harm, a constructionist approach, as we were saying, but at the same time, an attempt to give meaning and sense and dignity also to our bodily experiences. And this is very important for me because, as you know, confronting with environmental victims, human, in this case, environmental victims, but obviously not only, um, a lot of contamination is perceived by our senses. Mm? So we can see the smoke of the chimney, we can smell the contamination, but there are a lot of contamination dimensions that are not detectable, perceivable by our senses. If you think about, for example, radioactive dimensions. So I wanted to explore concretely with a methodological aspect, so from an empirical point of view, this kind of complex situation. But before showing you this instrument and also some images from the fieldwork, I wanted to share with you the main research question I asked myself and I asked the interviewee, people who are affected by environmental harm, when I started this kind of research. Because I think that it's very important also for young scholars, but not only, to have a clear idea of what are the research questions of their research before starting the research. Even if during the research we can learn a lot, and a sociologist and criminologist as our Becker taught a lot about this idea of dynamic role of research. So we can learn a lot during the research, but we need some starting point. So the three research questions, very complex, were the following one. Which significant visual and verbal narratives concerning the problem of environmental harm are used by the differently affected social actors? So this was the aspect I wanted to explore. The visual, but also the verbal, because narrative may be visual and verbal. So we are always constructing a story. Second issue, which visual and verbal narratives enable the direct environmental victims to become aware or to denial we spoke about, the existence of the crime? You see that I put existence in this way because at the beginning, before green criminology and more, environmental harm, environmental crime simply seems that didn't exist. So in order also to take seriously, as critical criminologists and green criminologists do, this kind of harm, it was very important also to work on the social perception of what is really a crime. And again, I recall the incredible work of our Becker about what is, I think that the title was in English, What About Murder? What About Mozart? Was a paradox. Because normally constructionist approach are accused of not giving enough consideration to the reality of crime. But I don't think this is the way. I think that we have to take seriously the reality of the crime, but at the same time, we have to give value, space, and dignity also to the construction dimension, the qualitative dimension of our interpretation of what is harm and crime. So, this kind of reflection brought me to the third question. What are the clues that allows us as observer to see and listen these levels of green criminological knowledge and to grasp its tragically elusive reality? I speak about clues. We have not evidences in this sense. We are working on a different level from the judiciary and so on. We are working on the clues as a researcher. We are discovering in reality in a collaborative work with people. So very concretely, I want to see things as these people, affected people by environmental harm, see. the situation where they live. And I can do this trying to put myself in their shoes with an active listening that needs a methodological tool that respect this kind of elusive reality. The elusive reality refers, to the idea that is something very tragically, but at the same time, sometimes it seems that is not happening. This is something that was very common in the perception of the victims I interviewed. There were people that they were saying, this is a crime, this is an environmental crime, it's terrible, it affected my life, my health, and so on. And other people of the same reality that were saying in good faith that for them the situation was quite normal. There was nothing tragic. And to me, this kind of dissonance and paradox resemble a little also the paradox we live uh, with climate change and negationism. So it is something that pertain to a specific context. I will show you the context, but also can speak to wider situation, as in the case of climate change. So, how to translate this theoretical issue into concrete methodology? This was the context I studied a lot of years in my life. Is Huelva, a city in Spain, in Andalusia, in the south of Spain. Is a town that is severely polluted by a massive industrial complex that was established at the beginning of the 60s of the last century, with a great number of chemical and energy corporations. It's maybe a little, sorry, I didn't open very well. Maybe it's better, yeah. If you can see, this is the city, and where there is one is the chemical plant, two is the beach of Punta del Cebo, as they call it, in the sense that before the chemical and plant, there was a beach where all the people were enjoying their life and their Sundays and so on, but now is very contaminated. And point three, there are these kind of radioactive basins. They call them balsas de fosfoyesos in Spanish. And this kind of situation was very and is very, very near to the city. But even if this is very near and very evident, we may say, self-evident, was not so clear to people. So there were people that were very conscious of this, but a lot of people that they couldn't see this kind of reality. And this was the paradox I wanted to explore. Let me share some definition of this methodology, photoelicitation. I start with this. Maybe a few 10 minutes, and then I stop also to give you some space to ask questions if you have, obviously. Photoelicitation interview are described by sociologist Douglas Harper as a process of organizing interview around photographs. And this is the crucial aspect that I want to underline. The assumption is that the meaning of the image remains in the mind of the viewer. So it is very democratic approach. I'm not the researcher who is imposing my interpretation to reality, but I'm asking to people to help me in reconstructing that kind of situation because they are the only owner of that kind of story. So the photographs became a reflexive and collaborative bridge between the subject, the interviewees, and the researcher. This is the visual picture I proposed to the interviewees. I tried to collect some photo in a visual exploration of the city and trying to put together 9 elements that were very paradoxical in that situation. So we have some kind of demonstration against the chemical, the industry, but there is also a black and white old photograph, vintage photograph, where the La Playa, the beach, was used by people. So it reconnects to a sort of a uh, idyllic past in the past. It's also nostalgia of the past. But also you see some kind of visual element, as in the photo below on the right, where there is the new plant painted blue and white as the color of Huelva, this city, and the old factory. So you see how there is also greenwashing, as we were saying, attitude to paint it in a very attractive way uh, in industry that is polluting the environment. But also, I had this kind of image from Google Earth, the image on the right, the second image in the middle on the right, because when I was there for the first time was 2008 and 9, Google Earth was not so used by people, but I spoke with some activists and they told me for the first time that we are gaining a consciousness and awareness of what this kind of contamination we're doing by this kind of democratic image from Google Earth. Because for the first time they could see this kind of black basins, basins de fosfoyeso, the radioactive basins, and they could appreciate how big they were and how dangerous were for the community. So you see how different visual dimensions converged in a complex picture in order to help people to develop a narrative of their experience of environmental victimization. So very concretely, I asked them to start from the piece of the visual collage of the puzzle they preferred, trying to construct their personal route in this kind of complex picture. And you see here an example of an encounter between two interviewees. Because in this case, I entered a shop and I started to interview a lady, the owner of the shop. But then another lady entered and wanted to comment also the image. So that kind of image became a sort of socio-environmental conflict context upon which these people were confronting their very different interpretation of the situation. And was very illuminating for me that they were indicating the black and white image, the vintage image, because normally photograph is seen as the evidence of something. So I take a photograph to let you see, to show you that I've been in that place of that thing happened. But they were contesting that kind of image that was the more real one of the image because it was also analogical image, not digital, so not modified, saying the one interviewee that this situation didn't exist because the beach was already contaminated, while the other interviewees told me that that situation existed because the beach before the factory came there were not contaminated. So you see how the paradox between a constructionist approach and a sensitive approach to the narrative of people, and also this idea that we have to go near to the reality of the situation, was really complex because we working on what we can see, we can perceive, we can sense, but we worked also with the narrative we have about that situation. Michelle Brown, in the Routledge International Handbook of Visual Criminology, told for the first time, I think, that the turn to the visual is indicative of a larger turn to the sensory that brings back the material that was the material, the materiality of the contamination, the physical, the affective and the embodied experiences of harm, control, injustice, and resistance. This kind of idea helped me to go beyond the visual in order to enter that kind of strange itinerant soliloquy I spoke you about. And when I discovered an anthropologist, Andrew Irving, who used a tool that was quite similar. He asked people to speak with themselves while working in a situation, but for different idea because they wanted to explore their trauma in health problem. I thought that that was really a very interesting methodological approach that could go beyond the conventional scientific method that often limits themselves to measure the situation. And they are not able to capture, as Irving says, the unfinished, ever-changing character of people's interior experiences and expression as they emerge in the present tense. This was very important because the issue of interiority that normally is left to psychoanalysts or people who study this kind of interiority here is addressed as a collaborative, practice-based ethnographic research question to be worked on together with the informants in the field. And so, very briefly, and then I stop, itinerant soliloquy helped me to consider how spaces, abstract spaces, become concrete places. Participants were asked to walk around that place and to try to express aloud, there was a recorder, the stream of consciousness that is their complex, chaotic narrative, personal narrative, composed by thoughts and emotions that might arise during the walk of the contaminated landscape, and to take photograph where the words were not sufficient. So in this process, the itinerant soliloquy became again a collaborative bridge that go beyond this kind of visual aspect. Here you can see these two participants in the itinerant soliloquy, walking, narrating, and photographing. And one is an activist, and the other is a person who lived a lot of personal experience regarding contamination. He also lost his wife very recently due to some cancer problem connected in some way to the contamination. Obviously, the cause-effect nexus is quite complex. We know also from a juridical point of view. And again, when the internal conversation was not able to give a meaning, to give a narrative to what they were seeing and perceiving, they used the photograph they had to take some clues, visual clues of what were the significant point in their narrative. I just 2 minutes so that we have some minutes more. The idea of Roland Barthes was really, really fundamental and crucial for me. Roland Barthes said that such is the photograph. It cannot say what it lets us see. And this is why, for me, was very important in photo elicitation, but also in itinerant soliloquy, in giving voice, giving value, giving space to the internal voices, to the internal dialogue of the environmental victim. So we can see an image, the visual aspect, but we need a personal narrative in order to enter in that kind of image and give a sense to that image from the perspective of people who are living in that situation. This is a quote from Italo Calvino, a very well-known Italian writer and thinker. And I think that my approach was quite similar. We can change my methodology aims at uniting the spontaneous generation of images and the intentionality of discursive thought. So visual criminology and narrative victimology. Even when the opening can be displayed by the visual imagination, putting its own intrinsic logic to work, it finds itself sooner or later caught in a web where reasoning and verbal expression also impose their logic. So they are different logic, the visual and the narrative, but they can be combined. They can be different tension that converge to a complex reconstruction of a scenario. Yet the visual solution continue to be the determining factor and sometimes unexpectedly come to decide situation that neither the conjecture of thoughts nor the resources or languages would be capable of resolving. So we really need, and I go, yes, to this point, really imagination in the sociological realm, but also in criminology. Obviously, we spoke a lot of criminological imagination, but I think that we need to translate this criminological imagination into concrete methodological devices. And again, as Calvino says, imagination as an instrument of knowledge, while following channels other than those of scientific knowledge, can coexist with the latter and can even assist it, indeed be a phase the scientist needs in order to formulate his hypothesis. So the idea is that we need to imagine new methodology not just for curiosity, but because they can help us really in giving a new insight to reality and in developing, a new theoretical gaze, a new hypothesis regarding very well-known phenomenon that are often taken for granted, as also environmental victimization. Sorry, just two images that I want to leave you now. During an itinerant soliloquy in Casale Monferrato, maybe you know, is a place in Italy very well known internationally because there is the problem of asbestos, and a lot of people died and are dying as a consequence of this kind of production. This is the sentence taken from the personal narrative of a victim of this situation. And he told me during the soliloquy, I don't consider myself a victim of this situation. I feel hurt by this situation, but not a victim. And you see how the concept of victim is quite complex. And the last one, each tumor, this mesothelioma is connected to asbestos, is an unjust punishment for any human being. But this is one of the most unjust you can have because it should not have been. So thank you very much for your listening. I really hope that was quite clear. I wanted also to see some faces because I only saw my slide. And really, thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Lorenzo. That's excellent presentation. I'll just stop the recording. We've got a couple of minutes left to us. So if there are any questions,